This Introduction to Bloodborne Pathogens training is a summary of the topics required under the OSHA Bloodborne Pathogens Standard. This training can be used for research institutions, can be adapted for healthcare organizations, the dental profession, or any other industry or organization where there is a risk of infection to bloodborne pathogens. Bloodborne pathogens programs are required at both the state and federal level. Its basic requirements include a written exposure control plan with procedures specific to the workplace, annual training requirements, and a hepatitis B vaccination program. It is always best to develop a program that is specific to the practices in your workplace as opposed to a generic one. As with all OSHA programs, there's a dual risk associated with regulatory citations as a result of non-compliance, as well as the civil liability associated with disease transmission among employees. An employee's initial introduction to the bloodborne pathogens program requires that you identify the bloodborne pathogens to which the employee may be exposed at work. It's required that you identify the organism, the disease that it causes, and any protective or prophylactic measures that are available to prevent the employee from becoming exposed or from becoming ill from exposure. Suffice it to say that this standard applies only to those pathogens to which employees may be exposed via a direct exchange of blood or other body fluids. The exposure control plan is a set of written procedures and safe work practices that identify how an employer controls and contains bloodborne pathogens and prevents the transmission and exposure of them to employees. Among the most important concepts under bloodborne pathogens is that of universal precautions. It is at the core and the foundation of the program and establishes precautionary measures that reinforce the risks to employees. Employers are required to identify potentially at-risk employees, or those employees whose job definitions or work activities may require them to enter work areas where bloodborne pathogens are handled, or work under conditions where there's a potential risk of exposure. This is important to ensure that each employee who may be at risk is provided the necessary precautions and prophylaxis to protect them. Control and containment of bloodborne pathogens is an important part of this program. By employing the principles of industrial hygiene and using a combination of engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment, an employer can develop procedures to ensure greater protection of their employees. Among the most prominent of the bloodborne pathogens, those being HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C, it is only hepatitis B that has a vaccination available. Therefore, employers are required to initiate a hepatitis B vaccination program for all affected employees. Under this standard, employers are required to identify the immunity status of all potentially at-risk employees identified in the exposure control plan. These records may be in several different forms, including records of hepatitis B vaccinations, of which it's a series of 3 shots administered over 6 months, records of hepatitis B titer tests that demonstrate immunity, or a signed declination form that the employee provides. Employers are required under this standard to develop procedures for responding to exposure incidents. There are also provisions for post-exposure follow-up in the event a transmission of a bloodborne pathogen has occurred. The exposure control plan must also have procedures for safely handling contaminated laundry where that potential exists. Depending on the industry or the operation, may depend on whether contaminated laundry is handled in-house or whether a vendor handles it. In either case, the procedures are intended to protect all employees who may come in contact with contaminated laundry. Waste disposal practices and procedures must also be defined in the exposure control plan. Unique to California, this waste is managed under the Medical Waste Management Act, which falls under the Health and Safety Code. It's important that employers understand that there may be multiple regulations and rules that apply to the handling of bloodborne pathogens aside from just simply complying with this OSHA standard. Finally, spill cleanup procedures are also included in the exposure control plan. This is important so that employees have guidance and instructions on safely cleaning up a spill and recognize that cleaning up spills of materials containing bloodborne pathogens may have an increased risk of exposure. This video summarizes the type of information that you would receive in an ARC Enterprises training on bloodborne pathogens. There are far more nuances and details to a program that you would be required to comply with. However, feel free to contact me with any questions, and I'd be happy to help answer them. Phone consultations cost nothing, and it would be great to hear from you.